last but not least, Mr. Bill Jones, if you can come to the podium from Schiller Institute. He'll talk about the economical aspect of the strategic partnership between the U.S. and Egypt.
If I make it up here. Actually, I got the notice early this morning to attend the forum, as one of my colleagues in New York couldn't make it here. So I made it in from Leesburg and parked up here in Capitol Hill, and I started walking down quickly here, and I got the worst cramp in my leg, and I could not walk almost. But there was a cabbie there, and I got a cab, so I got a couple blocks here and got out there. He didn't charge me for it, which was very nice of him. But I got here, so I made it up to the podium, and I have to work. Maybe I'll have the doctor look at that before I leave. But I've worked a lot. I worked as a journalist here for on 35 years now, and covered Capitol Hill for a long time, covered the White House. But I also did a lot of the diplomatic work. I knew most of the former ambassadors. Ambassador Minister Shukri, of course, I knew very shortly. I met him. Fahmy, Ahmed Maha, also I knew very well as many of the military attachés. So I'm acquainted with the Egyptian situation. I would like to talk, however, about the general environment in which U.S.-Egyptian relationships is now occurring, which is much different than it has been over the last few decades. A very important relationship. U.S. aid to Egypt has been very important for Egypt. And the Egypt cooperation with the United States has been extremely important for the U.S. in a region that has been very difficult to deal with. But as we go forward, a lot of things are changing in Egypt and in Africa generally. And the issue is the notion of economic development is now on the table big time. And it was put on the table, ironically, it was put on the table by the Chinese with this Belt and Road Initiative, which has had a tremendous effect in Africa and in Egypt. The United States, of course, much of what's going on with the port of Suez, the new Suez Canal, not only within Egypt, but within Africa as a whole, a network of railroads and highways, power plants, the nuclear program, the Russian nuclear program in Egypt, is also a signal of what is going to happen with the African continent. And it's a good thing. Now, of course, the notion that this Belt and Road Initiative has been met with a lot of skepticism here. Why? Because people say it's a Chinese gambit, it's a Chinese influence peddling. In one sense, maybe it is. They've gained a lot of influence with that. It has created what they call connectivity. And it has created a sense of optimism in the entire continent, which has been devastated for decades, that they too can develop. And of course, it's the continent with the greatest population explosion in the world. It's going to be a very important player as the world moves forward. So the issue of development then becomes key. And somehow the United States has got to get involved. If, you don't like, China says they want to work together. Maybe the United States should accept it. And if it's not true, they don't want to work together, then call their bluff. But if it is true, then why don't we try and find a way of working together? We got tremendous economic potential in the scientific and technological field in particular. We're still really number one. We could do a lot more things if we put our mind to it, but we still have that capability. This can be tremendously advantageous to Egypt in the economic development. I understand now, they have all these industrial parks now that are being built up. There's one in Egypt. Now, I understand that they are now the number one producer of fiberglass. Is that the case now? This is what I heard. I mean, this is really incredible. And it's a tremendous situation. But somehow, the United States has got to be a part of this. People say, well, we don't do infrastructure, and unfortunately, the U.S. government doesn't anymore. We rely on private industry, and private industry often has, considerations of a short-term profit, so they don't do a 10-year investment in a railroad, which is not going to show any profit for 10 years. But somehow that has got to change. And I think it is changing here on the Hill. We have this thing called OPIC, which is the attempt to support private industry in doing investment in terms of insurance and credits. And they're expanding this now because they realize that we've got to get in the mix of this thing again. Because this is going to be very important. And President Sisi, who has placed that the economic issue number one on the agenda, has had a tremendous effect in what he has done. And I think there's a tremendous amount of optimism as a result of that. So we're getting into a world now in which development is again on the agenda. We did a lot for Africa once upon a time during the Kennedy administration when we had this Soviet, U.S. conflict. We had to do it because we know if we didn't do it, the Soviet Union would do it. So we invested in Africa. With the end of the Cold War, with the demise of the Soviet Union, Africa was basically forgotten. It was forgotten by us. But of course, the Chinese have revived that again, so that we're in a new ballgame. Now we can say, okay, we'll do it in competition with the Chinese. That's one way of doing it. But maybe we can also do it in some way together with them. They say they want to do that. There have been meetings at the State Department. Early in the Trump administration, there was not this hysteria about China, and you had meetings in the State Department and elsewhere where they were talking about how do U.S. companies get involved in the Belt and Road. You had Chinese figures coming here talking about that. There was even the notion that there would be a liaison, a U.S. liaison with the Belt and Road to try and figure out how that can happen. And I'm hopeful that that can be revived. Of course, the atmosphere is much worse now, but, President Trump is still good buddies with President Xi, so maybe that would happen. But in terms of the overall policy of the United States, the U.S. has again got to use the economic potential that we possess in order to try and develop the world. The reason the U.S. had the tremendous reputation it had after World War II was not simply because we won the war, but it was also because Franklin Roosevelt was totally committed to industrializing Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And he was totally committed to ending all the empires, including the British. And he and Churchill had a fight about that over India and also over Africa. And Roosevelt wanted to come back to the Middle East, and he wanted to, after his presidency, to see how to build irrigation canals, to transform the desert, to green the desert. This is the reputation of the United States is built on that, but we've forgotten that. We've lost that to some extent. But now I think we're required to learn those lessons again, because what the Chinese have created is something that's not going to change. It has won the enthusiasm of the developing world and is also gaining a great interest in Europe. Look at Italy. Italy has joined the Belt and Road Initiative in spite of pressure not to do it. But it's in our own interest to do this as well, because we need that. We need to become a force for good. Infrastructure is the name of the game, and President Trump says he's in favor of infrastructure, and hopefully at some point he will start doing something concrete to build those trains, those railroads, and those highways, and those high-speed rail, which is now the name of the game, in the United States as well. But the two things don't contradict each other. Rebuilding the U.S. economy rebuilds our capability of helping others as well. And I think that's going to be extremely important. So I'm hopeful. I know that the security relationship is always going to be in front and center until you get some kind of overall stability in the Middle East. But I'm also convinced that without this economic package, without this economic aspect of development in the Middle East as a whole, you are never going to overcome terrorism. It will always, always be with you, because people will be living in a situation of hopelessness and economic despair, and they'll run to whatever group is there offering some kind of a solution, either here on Earth or on the other side. But if they have a purpose, if they have a purposeful existence here on Earth, based on becoming scientists or engineers or doctors or astronauts, then that gives them a purpose in life in which all this other stuff, recedes. And without that, economic development is not going to happen. So my hope is that as we're moving forward with the Trump administration and its relationship with Egypt, this issue of economic development cooperation, particularly in the areas of science and technology, I think should have become to play a much greater role, because that is what will really determine the future. And ultimately, I think the fight against terrorism is really the fight for development. Pope Pius VI once said, the new name for peace is development. And I think that's as relevant today as the day that he said that many decades ago.
I would like to thank all the panelists for their insights, and I actually would like to ask some questions. And I really wasn't planning to ask that question, but it really bothers me that every time that we hold these events, somehow the American side here in the U.S. are being fooled or deceived by the people that come from the Muslim Brotherhood under the cover of democracy and freedom of speech, and they would give false information about what happened in the Middle East. And I would like to talk about Egypt specifically, because that's where I'm focused on, and this is where I know things happening. And is there any way we can find this filtering system to be able to filter what's coming to the U.S., because this is very dangerous. These people come to the Capitol Hill, they come to the decision-making circles, they come to the policy research centers, and they infiltrate into these centers, and that's is how most of the politicians like to be politically correct and not to offend anybody and not just label anybody as a terrorist group. And it's a very fine line between being having a freedom of speech and being a terrorist. It really bothers me. So I would like to hear from Senator Dick Black on this, and also Michael Waller after that.
Well, by the way, I have passed around a letter that I shared with General el-Sisi, and it does touch specifically on the Muslim Brotherhood. To me, they are the political arm of Al-Qaeda, the group that brought down the Twin Towers on 9/11. They form the political foundation for them. There are a number of states that have declared them terrorist organizations. And I've got to tell you, when Saudi Arabia declares something a terrorist organization, it's got to be a terrorist organization. But the United States has always had this reluctance. If we were to declare them a terrorist organization, it would diminish the voice of so many people who are associated with the Muslim Brotherhood in the United States.
Can I play the devil advocate, if you don't mind me cutting you off? Do you think part of the reason, because this is something I believe, and I hope I'm wrong, but do you believe that previous administration had cut deals with these terrorist organizations, and now declaring them as a terrorist organization would get the administration in trouble?
Well, yes. The answer is yes, and I have some personal knowledge, but the Obama administration had a great minority outreach, which, that's fine, that's legitimate. However, within some of the mosques, there is a very powerful force of the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, not all of them. Some of them are great, upstanding organizations, but there is that element. And the element, unfortunately, sometimes takes a leadership role. And I think that with the Obama administration, as they sought to do this outreach, to bring Muslims into the administration, I think they ended up buying into the Muslim Brotherhood being sort of the conduit for bringing people in. I mean, you know, I have spent a good bit of time in Syria, where Syria is a 70% Muslim country. It's 10% Christian, which is roughly the same as Egypt. Of course, the Muslim Brotherhood is despised by the government and by the people over there, just as it is now in Egypt. They understand the deadly force that it exerts on political affairs. They are the nice face on what becomes a very violent organization. And
There has been many attempts by, I believe, at least Senator Ted Cruz and other congressmen in the past for a project to to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. And every time that happens, or try to pass the bill, there's the process gets aborted somehow. And I don't know where does it stop. We feel like when you download something in the computer and it takes, the computer is thinking, and all of a sudden it crashes. So what happens there?
Well, I'm sorry, Jonathan Weiner's not here to be on the panel like he was supposed to be, because he has been joined at the hip with the Muslim Brotherhood for decades and helped with the mess in Libya and elsewhere. And he tried to get me under oath before, and I wish I could have posed some questions to him today. But since I can't, this is part of the complexities of politics here, where you have one of Ted Cruz's former top staffers, Nick Muzzin, who's a registered agent of Qatar, who is going around as a Jewish activist and former Ted Cruz staffer, arranging for American Jews to go to Qatar and see what a wonderful place it is. So this is a problem when you ask how is it that even certain good guys on the Hill can't get momentum even when their own party runs the chamber in the Senate. Cruz doesn't have anything to do with Muzzin's activities, but this is just a fact, and it's something that we have to deal with when we wonder why don't certain things get passed. You have a new chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations.
So you mean the answer is lobbying and money? Is that what it is?
That's a big answer, yeah. And then it's funneled through various people who don't declare that they're on the take from these same registered agents, and then they end up getting investigated years later. Too much water has gone under the bridge by that time. I think there'll be more momentum now because you have John Bolton's very favorable toward this, so it's been said. Secretary Pompeo has been open to it, but he doesn't have many allies inside the State Department bureaucracy to do it. I think the Treasury Department will be open to it. It's just a question of getting the president's attention on it and somehow tying it in with the peace plan that Jared Kushner's been pushing for Israel and the Palestinians, and I'm sure that he's getting pressure from certain elements to leave the Brotherhood alone as a, quote, moderating influence to keep Hamas quiet.
I want to say something about my senators used to work very closely with Pakistan, and no matter how big of a mess we think Egypt might be, it's nothing compared to Pakistan. Egypt is just too big and too important. And I would say that in my estimation, the cooperation now, and they keep it kind of quiet, so I'm not going to really mention these countries, but between Israel, Jordan, and Egypt is better and stronger than it's probably ever been. And I think a lot of that has to do with American glue, kind of our relationship with Jordan and our relationship with Israel and our relationship with Egypt. So I just hope that that continues to move forward.
Mr. Jones, Egyptian people have been going through a rough economical patch, and Senator Dick Black has mentioned that as well. And President Sisi and the government has taken very, very strict decisions to make sure that they want to make sure that this happens right. We can, for a short period of time. What's your advice to the current government to do from the economical perspective to make sure that they keep the momentum, build on what they gained over the last painful 2 years, and hopefully get things in the positive end, and rather than keep suffering?
Well, my advice would be simply to stay the course, because what is happening now, if you look at it in the global situation, the Suez Canal, of course, is on one of the main corridors of development, from the east to the west. And that port is going to become extremely important, because what is being built now with all the, railroad connections and the sea connections in the context of this Belt and Road, Egypt is going to be the nodal point connecting these two. So you're going to need development in terms of the industrial parks which are being developed. I think that will continue. I think President Sisi, of course, is oriented towards this. And like I say, I would like a little more American involvement in this, because I think it is it's gestating at this moment. And I think if the U.S. would get involved, this would be a good thing. It would increase the pace, but it would also establish a much closer relationship with Egypt on the program, which I think is most important for President Sisi today, which is this economic development. But I'm very optimistic, and I think that staying the course in terms of proceeding with this development project is really the name of the game, because, look, it's going to happen. It's like a train that has left the station, and it's going to take off, and it has the enthusiasm both in Egypt and in other parts of Africa. And I would also say that looking at Egypt, that the government must see itself in terms of the effect it has on the rest of Africa, because Egypt is one of the most developed areas in Africa, and therefore, if you can get this development to flow to the other countries in the region, it then becomes a regional phenomenon, not just an Egyptian phenomenon, creating, I think, interesting and helpful ties with the nations, with your neighbors, but it also brings a certain amount of prestige to Egypt. As it develops, it helps Africa to develop. And I think that's what we're looking at. So stay the course. It's going pretty well, and we hope that it'll reach its goal.
Senator Black, this is the last question before I open the floor for questions from you guys. I can't help it but think we're in 2019, and the pattern has been repeating itself. Wars are not getting us anywhere. Killing people are not getting people anywhere. Yes, some countries benefit economically better than others, but is this really the way we want to live? Do you think our American understanding of dealing with issues in other different parts of the world has been changed, and we've been acting in a different way?
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, let me tell you, I don't come as a pacifist. I was a Marine officer. I'm a helicopter pilot, flew 269 combat missions, came back with bullet holes in the plane 4 times, then fought on the ground. My radio men were killed right next to me. I was wounded. I love our military people, and I greatly respect what they do. However, when I was later a JAG officer over in Germany, I remember I was getting a space available flight back to the States, and I'm looking up on the board to see, when one's going. And I noticed there are all these flights going into Riyadh and going into Oman and places. And I thought, gosh, if I just had a couple of more days, I'd just take a jump on a plane and I'd go over there and just wander around. And now I'm talking about in the 80s, okay? In the 80s, I could have gone over there, I could have rented a motor scooter and put on a backpack, and I could have traveled all over the Middle East, I think in relative safety. I stand to be corrected by some of you who know better than I am. But we didn't have this antagonism towards the United States. And at the same time, the United States was not nearly so deeply involved. Now, I understand, I'm familiar with the history of our involvement in Iran. I know, we previously were involved in a coup in Syria. We have not been pristine by any means, but what happened is somewhere around the time of 9/11, you had Dick Cheney, you had Wolfowitz, you had a number of extremely aggressive individuals who came in, and there's something that you can find on the internet very easily if you just Google the words 7 countries in 5 years, and you'll come up with very high quality videos of General Wesley Clark, who was the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, so he was the top 4-star commander outside of the Pentagon. And he said right after 9/11, he visits with the Secretary of Defense, then he's down with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. One of his friends says, on the second meeting says, look, he says, we've been ordered to come up with plans to overthrow 7 Middle Eastern countries in the next 5 years. Now, we didn't meet the 5-year pattern, but we're on the cycle. The last one is Iran. And if you look at what we have accomplished, I cannot tell you a single thing positive, a single positive outcome from any of the wars. We attacked Iraq, which had not threatened us. It was extremely anti-terrorist, had a large, thriving Christian community, which is practically gone. We go into Afghanistan, situation a little bit different there, but here we are 18 years later, mucking around, now we're starting to compliment the Taliban on how wonderful they are and how they might make good leaders. And Syria was totally at peace. And in 2006, the U.S. Embassy issued a document that was released by WikiLeaks. God bless them for what they do. And it laid out a plan to destabilize and overthrow a totally peaceful nation. Syria at the time, having 40 years of peace with Israel, the greatest women's rights of any Arab country, the greatest religious freedom of any Arab country, and we're going to overthrow them. Why? What are we doing? And I think you mentioned, of course, the Chinese initiative, and if you look, we are, from a very high level, we are losing the philosophical battle because the Chinese are going in and they're saying, we're going to work with whoever's there, whatever your government, that's your business, but we're going to build infrastructure, we're going to try to make some deals and that kind of thing. And then, on the other hand, you have the United States, and we go in, we become friendly. The next thing, we smear the leader of the country. We smear the country. We say, you're terrible. And the next thing, we declare a no-fly zone, and under the guise of, we're going to settle things down, we bomb the country into utter oblivion. Libya is the classic case where they had not done a single thing aggressive towards us, and we went in and we bombed them so thoroughly. And these were not military targets. These were everything. I mean, these were businesses, they were homes, they were hospitals, they were government buildings, they were everything, and utterly wiped out the infrastructure. And now there are 3 competing governments in Libya. None of them hold sway, and there's total anarchy after 8 years. So I think the problem we face is that world leaders look and they say, okay, we've got these 2 paradigms, which do we prefer the Chinese who come in? And I'm not here to advocate the Chinese. I'm here to change the Americans. They say, okay, the Chinese come in, they help us, they don't mess around with us, and the Americans come in and they bomb us to smithereens and leave us impoverished for the next 50 years. And so I think we have a problem philosophically. We're not appealing to other nations. And I think this business of perpetual warfare, I defy anybody on this panel or anybody in the audience to tell us how many wars the United States is currently fighting. I've tried, and you end up with a definitional problem. What do you consider a war? How much violence reaches the level of a war? I can't tell you. I spent 32 years as a frontline combat officer, and I cannot tell you how many wars we're fighting. Something is seriously wrong when you fall into this situation. And I very much liked the proposals that President Trump campaigned on to diminish the role of NATO, which I think has outlived its usefulness, to normalize relations with Russia, which I see as a zero threat to us unless we do something that triggers a nuclear conflagration, and to work with Russia, or with Syria rather, to take care of the terrorists and get out. And none of it has happened because the deep state is just, it's like this snowball, or avalanche rather, rolling downhill, and nobody can get control of it. So your answer, in a very short phrase, the American policy, the American foreign policy today is the worst that I have seen in my lifetime, and it relies on perpetual violence, and it's spreading throughout the world, and we've got to somehow get control of it before it really devours us, and devours our political soul and our projection to other nations.
Thank you. If anyone has a question? Yes. Would you like to come to this mic?
My question is for our good friends from Egypt. And I have two concerns. I always have a lot of questions, never enough time. So my question is, what is your relationship going to be with Qatar moving forward? And number two, the issue of South Sudan and North Sudan and the terrorism that has been spread thanks to a number of friends, quote unquote, from Qatar, and the training of these individuals for the MB, and the amount of MB that has been expounded through Africa as a result of the quote-unquote investment by Qatar. And that's all I've got for the moment.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. So actually, I think Egypt is one of the countries that their stance on things are always stable. When Egypt take a decision on something, I think it's very, very hard to go back unless the circumstances completely change 180 degrees. So when Egypt and the other three countries in the Middle East decided to stop dealing with Qatar completely, this is never going to go back unless Qatar changes completely. I mean, we like to forgive, but we can't. We have zero tolerance. Egypt has zero tolerance with dealing with countries that bluntly support terrorism. And as you said, I wrote down the points that you mentioned. It's all coming back to Qatar. It's all related to Qatar. Qatar is, They had a big part in Sudan and what's happening between the south and the north. And we noticed when Egypt had a little bit of a hard time trying to figure out what they're going to do when the Ethiopia has decided to build their dam. And then we'll see Qatar right away in the picture going to Sudan, trying to help them out, fund them, do whatever it takes to just ruin it for Egypt. And it's just amazing. So I think Egypt will stand still on their decision that we're never going to deal with Qatar unless they can come back nice and clean. And I'll tell you honestly, my opinion, it's never going to happen. So, well, anybody would like to comment at the same time? Any other questions? All right, so I guess we'll wrap it up. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming today, and really appreciate your presence. And thanks for everybody on the panel. And it's been fun.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
جوا منك حلم ممكن يبقى مش باين قوي، وانت تايه بين حاجات وعايشها بدماغ فهلاوي، عايش بتلعن في الظروف مع ناس هدفها تكون كده، ناس قصدها تبقى موقفاك، مش عايزة تبقى فيهم قوي. شوف واقرا في كتاب التاريخ، عمرك ما كنت في يوم غبي، ده انت اللي علمت البشر. شوف عاش في أرضك كام نبي، في ناس بتكره لو تفكر، نفسهم فكرك يقف، عقدة خواجة بيخلقوها وبيبهروك بالأجنبي. الحكاية مش بلون وشكل وهدوم، الحكاية إنك قوي رغم الهموم. طلع البطل اللي جواك، يلا قوم، انت تقدر تظبط الأحوال بالظبط.
هنشيل بلدنا على كتافنا، مش هنسيبها ومش هنضيعها، ومش هنخلي حد يقدر يضيعها.
بالنكتة بنقابل ظروف، من غيرها كنا هنتعسر، والطيبة فينا